The communal dining facility in Sector 7 of Bastion's Rest operated on predictable rhythms. Peak hours saw hundreds of residents crowding the space, creating the kind of controlled chaos typical of any large institutional setting. Mid-hours brought moderate traffic as people cycled through between activities. And off-peak hours, the quiet spaces between established meal times, belonged to those who preferred solitude or couldn't tolerate crowds. Kalith Vorsai had been eating during off-peak hours for 11 years. She entered the facility at approximately 3 in the afternoon by station time, when the lunch rush had dissipated, and the dinner preparations hadn't yet drawn evening crowds. The space was perhaps 15% occupied, residents scattered across tables in loose clusters or solitary positions that suggested either antisocial preference or social isolation. Kalith collected her meal from the automated service counter, standard nutritional fare that met Marithian dietary requirements without being particularly interesting, and surveyed available seating with practiced efficiency. She chose a small table near a viewport overlooking the station's docking area, positioned to observe the room's entrances while maintaining maximum distance from other occupied tables. She sat, arranged her meal with careful precision, and propped her data tablet against her water glass. The tablet displayed archive cataloging work she'd been processing, historical records from a minor trade dispute 3 centuries ago, the kind of documentation that required attention but not deep intellectual engagement, perfect for occupying her mind without demanding emotional investment. Around her, the dining facility hummed with the ambient sounds of institutional life. Quiet conversations at distant tables, the soft chime of service counters preparing orders, the occasional announcement from the station's communication system. Kalith had learned to filter these sounds into white noise, background static that reinforced her isolation without requiring active engagement. She ate methodically, reviewing her cataloging work with the portion of her attention that wasn't devoted to maintaining awareness of her surroundings. Old habits from her previous life, the constant tactical assessment of environments, the automatic monitoring of potential threats or opportunities. She'd been crown princess of a major interstellar empire. That kind of training didn't disappear just because the empire had. No one approached her table. No one made eye contact longer than the brief acknowledgement required by basic courtesy. She was present in the space but not participating in it, visible but not seen. Exactly as she'd been for 11 years. Exactly as she preferred, she told herself. Isolation was safer than engagement. Invisibility was preferable to the complicated social navigation that came with being recognized as what she'd once been. Better to be the Marithian woman who kept to herself than Crown Princess Kalith Vorsa, heir to a fallen empire, reminder of political catastrophes and civilizational collapse. She'd almost convinced herself she believed that. The dining facility's entrance opened with its characteristic soft hiss of pressurized doors, and Kalith glanced up with automatic tactical awareness. A human entered, tall, perhaps in his late 30s, wearing the dark uniform of station security with commander's insignia on his collar. New acquisition to the station's personnel, Kalith noted with the analytical detachment she applied to most observations. She'd seen him conducting patrols over the past week, learning the station's geography with methodical thoroughness. The human, Commander Tors, according to the nameplate visible even at this distance, collected his meal from the service counter and surveyed the available seating with the same tactical assessment Kalith had performed minutes earlier. His gaze swept across the space, cataloging occupied tables and solitary diners, evaluating options with professional efficiency. Then he walked directly toward Kalith's table. She tensed involuntarily, old reflexes preparing for confrontation or unwanted social interaction. But the commander simply stopped beside her table and gestured to the empty chair with casual courtesy. "Mind if I join you?" Most other tables are either too close to the air circulation vents or too far from the viewports. This one seems optimal. Caliph stared at him, genuinely surprised. People didn't ask to join her table. People avoided her table with the careful courtesy reserved for those who occupied ambiguous social positions, not dangerous enough to fear, not irrelevant enough to ignore completely, but definitely someone to maintain polite distance from. The commander waited patiently for her response, his expression showing nothing but mild inquiry. No recognition of who she was, no discomfort with her presence, no calculation about whether association with her carried political implications. Just a straightforward question about sharing a table. Caliph's first instinct was refusal, to preserve the isolation that had become her armor against a universe that had taken everything from her. But the commander was already setting down his tray with the casual assumption that her lack of immediate objection constituted consent, and suddenly saying, "Please sit elsewhere," felt more awkward than simply allowing it. "Of course," she managed, her voice slightly rough from limited social use. "Please." Commander Torres sat with the economical movements of someone trained in military discipline, arranging his meal with the same methodical precision Caliph had used. He didn't immediately force conversation, which Caliph found unexpectedly comfortable. They ate in silence for several minutes, and Caliph gradually relaxed as it became clear the commander wasn't going to subject her to awkward small talk or intrusive questions. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the invasive curiosity she'd learned to dread. "Commander David Torres, Station Security. I've been meaning to introduce myself to more residents as I familiarize myself with the station." "You are?" "Caliph," she responded, deliberately omitting the surname that carried too much historical weight. "I work in the archives." "The archives must be interesting work," Torres observed while cutting his food into precise portions. "I imagine this station has accumulated quite a historical record over the decades. Every exile brings their own documentation, their own perspective on galactic events." The comment surprised Caliph with its insight. Most people viewed the archives as bureaucratic storage, not as the rich historical dataset they actually represented. More than most people realize, 11,000 years of galactic political history passes through this station's records. Revolutions, coups, succession disputes, governmental collapses, every major political transformation of the past century is documented here through the eyes of those who lost. Torres paused in his eating, genuine interest showing in his expression. "That's a fascinating perspective. Do you find patterns in those records, common factors in how governments fall, how leaders end up in exile?" The question activated something in Caliph that had been dormant for years, intellectual engagement with someone who actually cared about the answer rather than asking out of polite obligation. There are definite patterns. Governments fall most often not from external pressure, but from internal contradictions they refuse to address. Leaders end up here usually because they underestimated how quickly loyalty evaporates when power shifts. Almost everyone in exile believed themselves secure right up until the moment they weren't. That suggests most political collapses are somewhat predictable, at least in retrospect. Retrospect provides clarity that present circumstances obscure. It's easy to identify warning signs when you're reviewing historical records decades after events. Much harder when you're living through the situation, when every decision feels urgent, and every choice seems reasonable given available information. Torres nodded thoughtfully, chewing while processing her analysis. That's a more sophisticated framework than what most political news coverage provides. They tend to treat governmental collapses as sudden surprises rather than predictable outcomes of identifiable patterns. News coverage focuses on drama and immediate events. Historical analysis focuses on structural factors and long-term trajectories. Different purposes, different perspectives. Caliph found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the intellectual discussion despite her usual careful distance. If you want to understand why a government fell, you need to examine not just the immediate trigger, but the accumulated contradictions that made collapse inevitable once any significant stress was applied. Their conversation continued, ranging across topics of political science, historical analysis, governmental structures. Tours asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine engagement with the subject matter. Caliph responded with analysis she developed during her years as crown princess, training that emphasized understanding political systems from theoretical and practical perspectives simultaneously. At one point, Tours mentioned recent news about a planetary government experiencing civil unrest, protests over economic policies, tensions between civilian leadership and military commanders. Based on your pattern analysis, do you think they're heading toward collapse or just temporary instability? Caliph considered the question seriously, applying the analytical frameworks she'd spent years developing. The critical variable is whether military leadership believes they can improve their position through regime change. If military commanders see opportunity in instability, if they calculate that seizing power would serve their interests better than maintaining current governmental structure, then collapse becomes highly probable. If they believe their interests are better served by preserving existing arrangements, the government will likely weather the unrest regardless of how dramatic popular protests appear. So the question isn't really whether citizens are upset about economic policies. It's whether the people with institutional power, particularly military force, decide to act on that upset. Precisely. Popular discontent is necessary but insufficient for regime change. You need elite defection, people with institutional power deciding their future lies in destroying current structures rather than preserving them. Without that elite defection, protests remain protests. With it, they become revolutions. Tours absorbed this with evident appreciation for the analytical clarity. That's a much more useful framework than what news analysts provide. They focus extensively on protest size and public sentiment, but you're right. That's not what actually determines outcomes. It's elite decision-making about where their interests lie. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Caliph found herself engaging with intellectual intensity she hadn't experienced since before the empire's fall. Her mind working through complex political problems with the facility that came from years of training and practical experience. Tours proved to be an excellent conversational partner, asking clarifying questions, offering relevant observations, demonstrating genuine comprehension of nuanced concepts. When Tours finally checked his chronometer and showed mild surprise at the time, he offered genuine appreciation. I really value this discussion. Your insights are extremely useful for understanding the political dynamics I'm trying to maintain security around. Would you mind if I joined you again sometime? I'd appreciate the opportunity to continue learning from your expertise. The request caught Caliph completely off guard. Someone wanted to continue talking with her. Someone found her analysis valuable enough to seek repeated conversations. The proposition felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. I typically eat here during off-peak hours, she managed carefully. If your schedule permits, you're welcome to join me. Tours smiled with uncomplicated warmth. I'll make a point of it. Thank you, Caliph. This has been the most intellectually engaging conversation I've had since arriving at the station. He collected his tray, offered a respectful nod, and departed with the same economical movements he'd used arriving. Caliph sat very still after he left, staring at her data tablet without actually seeing the cataloging work displayed there. Someone had sat with her. Someone had engaged her in serious intellectual discussion. Someone had treated her perspectives as valuable, had listened to her analysis as if her insights actually mattered rather than as if she were simply a historical curiosity or diplomatic embarrassment. Someone had looked at her and seen a person worth talking to, not a fallen princess worth avoiding. Around the dining facility, Other residents had noticed the interaction with varying degrees of interest. A Centauri physician dining alone several tables away observed with clinical curiosity. A Telvari merchant finishing his meal filed the information away because unusual interactions suggested potentially valuable intelligence. A cluster of military exiles at a corner table exchanged speculative glances, wondering why the new security chief spent an hour in serious conversation with the Marithian woman everyone had learned to politely ignore. Caliph was aware of the attention with the same tactical consciousness that monitored everything in her environment. But for once, she didn't care what others thought or how they interpreted her behavior. Because for 1 hour, she'd felt like herself again. Not Crown Princess Caliph Vorsai with all the complicated weight that title carried, but simply Caliph, someone whose thoughts mattered and whose expertise had value. She returned to her residential unit later that afternoon, small quarters that had been home for 11 years. The space was modest but adequate: living area, sleeping quarters, basic food preparation facilities, bathroom. She'd personalized it minimally over the years, adding a few cultural artifacts from her previous life, some books and data storage containing Marithian literature and history, a small collection of plants that reminded her of the palace gardens she'd loved as a child. She sat in her customary chair, the one positioned to observe the door and the single small viewport that looked out onto the station's interior architecture. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think seriously about who she'd been before exile, about the capabilities she'd possessed before everything was stripped away. Crown Princess Caliph Vorsai had been trained from childhood to govern. Political science, economic policy, diplomatic negotiation, military strategy. Her education covered every aspect of imperial administration. She'd been good at it, genuinely skilled, contributing meaningfully to her father's government, and preparing herself for the responsibilities she would eventually inherit. Then the Civil War came. The assassination, the palace siege, the desperate escape, and the years of hiding before the Dominion peacekeepers found her and offered protective asylum that felt more like comfortable imprisonment. She'd spent 11 years telling herself that those skills didn't matter anymore, that her training was worthless without formal position to apply it through, that she was simply a historical footnote waiting to be completely forgotten. But Commander Tors had demonstrated something she'd lost sight of. Expertise has value independent of formal authority. Her analysis was useful because it was sophisticated and accurate, not because she held any particular title. Her insights mattered because they helped people understand complex situations, not because she could command them to listen. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as worthless as 11 years of isolation had convinced her she was. Caliph pulled up her personal data archive, files she'd avoided opening for years because they hurt too much to review. Records from her time as Crown Princess, policy debates she'd participated in, diplomatic negotiations she'd helped navigate, governance frameworks she'd contributed to developing. Evidence of a person who'd once mattered, who'd once made meaningful contributions to something larger than personal survival. She reviewed the materials with new eyes, seeing not just painful reminders of loss, but evidence of capabilities that perhaps hadn't disappeared just because her circumstances had changed. The analytical skills Tors had appreciated during their conversation, those came from this training, from years of education and practical experience that no political collapse could actually erase. That night, Caliph made a decision. Tomorrow, during her archive work, she would access the political analysis databases she'd been avoiding for years. Not to wallow in grief over what was lost, but to sharpen skills that apparently still had practical value. Because if Commander Tors was going to seek her expertise again, and his tone had suggested genuine intention rather than polite courtesy, she wanted that expertise to be as refined as possible. In her small residential unit, surrounded by the modest possessions that represented 11 years of exile, Caliph Vorsai began remembering what it felt like to have purpose beyond simple survival. And though she cautioned herself against hope, against believing that one conversation could fundamentally change anything, she couldn't quite suppress the dangerous feeling awakening somewhere deep in her chest. Dignity. The quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, she mattered after all. Commander David Torres approached his new position as station security chief with the same methodical professionalism he'd applied to every assignment during his 20-year career in peacekeeping operations. Bastion's Rest presented unique challenges compared to his previous postings. Maintaining order among 12,000 political exiles required different skills than conventional security work. These weren't criminals or threats. They were displaced leaders, deposed monarchs, exiled revolutionaries. People accustomed to wielding power, now confined to neutral sanctuary while galactic politics churned on without them. His predecessor, Security Chief Valen, had maintained order primarily through surveillance and professional distance. Monitor residents, identify potential conflicts before they escalated, enforce station regulations with consistent neutrality. It was effective but impersonal, treating residents as problems to manage rather than people to protect. Torres preferred a different approach. His peacekeeping training emphasized that people were less likely to cause problems when they felt seen, heard, acknowledged. Security wasn't just about preventing incidents. It was about creating environments where incidents became less likely through positive relationship building. So he made himself visible and accessible. He introduced himself to residents during patrols, asked about their concerns, made casual conversation that helped him understand the station's social dynamics. Some residents appreciated the personal attention. Some found it intrusive. Some were simply confused by a security officer who seemed genuinely interested in their perspectives. 2 weeks into his tenure, Torres had established a routine of eating meals in communal dining facilities during various shifts, rotating through different times and locations to observe resident patterns and make himself available for informal conversation. It was during one of these routine meals that he'd encountered Caliph in the Sector 7 facility, and discovered that beneath the quiet exterior was someone with extraordinary expertise in exactly the kind of political dynamics he was trying to understand. Their first conversation had been revelatory. Torres had expected basic courtesy and maybe superficial discussion. Instead, he'd found someone who could articulate sophisticated analytical frameworks, who understood governmental structures from both theoretical and practical perspectives, who offered insights that helped him comprehend the complex social ecosystem he was responsible for protecting. He made a point of returning to the Sector 7 dining facility during off-peak hours, timing his meals to coincide with Caliph's regular schedule. It wasn't difficult. She maintained consistent patterns, and Torres was good at observing patterns. Their second conversation, 3 days after the first, picked up where they'd left off. Torres asked about specific residents whose behavior suggested potential security concerns, and Caliph provided context that helped him distinguish genuine threats from cultural misunderstandings or personality quirks. The Centauri academic in Sector 4, Torres mentioned. He seems to maintain extensive communications with his homeworld despite being officially exiled. Should I be concerned about that? Caliph considered the question while methodically working through her meal. Centauri political culture doesn't treat exile as permanent separation the way some species do. For them, exile is more like temporary displacement. You've lost your current position, but you're expected to maintain relationships that might enable eventual return or at least influence from distance. His communications are probably less concerning than they appear. So monitoring without intervention. Unless the communications involve active coordination of violent action or clear violations of asylum protocols. Yes, Centauri exiles who maintain connections often provide valuable intelligence about homeworld politics, which can help you anticipate whether their exile status might change or whether new Centauri exiles might arrive. It was exactly the kind of nuanced guidance tours needed, understanding not just what people were doing, but what their behavior meant within cultural context. Caliph possessed that understanding across multiple species and political systems, accumulated through years of study and practical experience. Their conversations became regular occurrences. 3 times per week, sometimes 4, Tors would join Caliph during her off-peak dining schedule. Sometimes he'd ask specific questions about residents or situations. Sometimes they'd discuss broader political patterns, theoretical frameworks for understanding governmental transitions. Sometimes they'd simply eat together in comfortable silence, two people who discovered they enjoyed each other's company without needing constant verbal engagement. To Tors, this was valuable professional development and personally pleasant companionship. He was learning his operational environment while also finding someone whose intellectual engagement made meals more interesting than solitary eating. To Caliph, each interaction felt simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because Tors treated their conversations as unremarkable exchanges between colleagues with complementary expertise. Extraordinary because no one else on the station treated her this way. No one else sought her opinions, valued her insights, or simply sat with her as if her presence were welcome rather than awkward. But their developing acquaintance created ripples through the station's social ecosystem that neither of them initially recognized. Other residents noticed that Commander Tors, the new security chief, regularly sought the Marithian exile's company and treated her with consistent respect. This violated the unspoken protocol that someone in Caliph's position, completely fallen royalty with no realistic restoration prospects, should be politely avoided. Small gestures began shifting. The former Telvari ambassador, always alert to changing social dynamics, started nodding acknowledgement when he passed Caliph in corridors. Not friendly exactly, but recognizing her presence with the respect afforded to someone worth noticing. A Centauri academic who'd previously avoided eye contact began offering polite greetings. Minor changes, but Caliph noticed each one with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. During one of their regular meals, approximately 3 weeks into their established pattern, Tors mentioned recent news about escalating tensions on a planetary government. The situation you analyzed last week, the government with civil unrest and military tensions, it's developing exactly as you predicted. The military leadership announced there, assuming temporary governance responsibilities to restore order. Classic coup language dressed up as emergency response. Caliph had been following the situation through archive news feeds. The pattern is depressingly consistent. Military forces intervene claiming temporary necessity, then discover that restoring civilian rule is premature or destabilizing. Within 2 years, they'll be presenting themselves as permanent government and claiming legitimacy through effective administration rather than democratic process. You've seen this pattern before. The statement hung in the air, and Caliph realized Tors was inviting deeper conversation about her background. She'd been carefully avoiding personal history, keeping their discussions focused on abstract political analysis rather than her specific experiences. But Tors had been consistently respectful, consistently genuine. Maybe he'd earned some honesty. "I've studied dozens of similar transitions through historical records," she said carefully. "And I've experienced one directly. The Marithian Empire's collapse followed similar patterns. Military commanders who'd served my father decided their interests were better served by removing the monarchy entirely, rather than simply replacing the emperor with more compliant royalty." Tor's expression showed recognition. He'd clearly reviewed her file at some point and knew at least the basic facts of her background. But he didn't treat this revelation as scandal or gossip opportunity. He simply nodded with the same professional respect he'd shown throughout their conversations. That must make reviewing these historical patterns personally difficult, constantly being reminded of what you experienced. Initially, yes. For years, I avoided the political analysis databases entirely because they hurt too much. But recently I've been reconsidering that approach. Caliph paused, then decided to offer the honest admission. Our conversations have reminded me that analytical skills don't disappear just because circumstances change. That expertise has value independent of formal position. So I've been sharpening those skills again, rather than letting them atrophy. That's good to hear. Your expertise is genuinely valuable. It helps me do my job better, helps me protect people more effectively. Torres paused. Though I have to admit, I'm curious why you've kept such a low profile for so long if you possess this kind of analytical capability. Surely, there are residents here who could benefit from political consultation or strategic advice. Caliph was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share. There are protocols about people in my position, unspoken rules about visibility and engagement. When you've fallen as completely as I have, when your restoration prospects are essentially zero, the polite thing is to remain obscure. To avoid reminding people of uncomfortable political histories or creating diplomatic complications for governments that prefer to pretend you don't exist. That sounds like a protocol designed to make other people comfortable rather than to serve your interests. Most protocols are designed exactly that way. Their conversation continued, but something had shifted. Torres now understood that Caliph's isolation wasn't just personal preference, but the product of systematic social architecture designed to render her invisible. And Caliph now understood that Torres' consistent respect wasn't random courtesy, but deliberate choice. A refusal to participate in protocols that devalued people based on political convenience. The shift became more apparent when, 2 days later, Administrator Thurin called Torres to his office for what he described as a brief discussion about protocol and resident management. Thurin was a Talesian, tall, gray-skinned, with the careful diplomatic bearing that came from decades managing complex political situations. Commander Torres, Thurin began with his characteristic formal courtesy, I've noticed you've developed a regular association with resident Caliph Vorsi. I want to ensure you're aware of the sensitivities involved with that particular individual. Torres kept his expression professionally neutral. Sensitivities. Her file lists her as low threat level, no security incidents in 11 years of residence, no concerning associations. Is there something in her background I should be aware of? It's not about security threat in the conventional sense. It's about political delicacy. Thurin activated a holographic display showing Caliph's full file, not the abbreviated version Torres had reviewed, but the complete record including historical context. Caliph Vorse was crown princess of the Mauritian Empire before its collapse during civil war. The current Mauritian government, the collective, has built significant portions of their legitimacy on the claim that the royal family is extinct, that the monarchy's corruption and incompetence made revolution necessary. But she's obviously not extinct. She lives in Sector 7 and works in our archives. Officially, she doesn't exist. The collective knows she's here. They arranged her initial placement through Dominion peacekeeping channels, but there's an understanding that she remains obscure. Invisible, not actively claiming legitimacy or maintaining visibility that could complicate the collective's political narrative. Torres processed this information, his expression carefully controlled but his tone showing edge. So the protocol is to keep her isolated and ignored to avoid upsetting the government that destroyed her family and stole her birthright through military coup. The protocol is to maintain the political balance that allows this station to function as neutral sanctuary for 12,000 exiles from hundreds of conflicts across multiple sectors. The Marithian Collective has been generous in supporting this station's operational funding. We don't want to jeopardize that relationship by appearing to provide platform or legitimacy to someone they've declared extinct. Thurin's expression showed sympathetic understanding. I know it seems unjust, Commander, but asylum politics requires uncomfortable compromises. We can't save everyone or right every wrong. We do what we can within constraints imposed by powers larger than ourselves. And what exactly are you asking me to do, Administrator? Stop having conversations with a resident who provides valuable analytical insights that help me perform my security duties more effectively. I'm asking you to be aware of the implications and exercise appropriate discretion. Your regular, visible association with Caliph raises her profile within the station's social ecosystem. Other residents are beginning to treat her differently because you're treating her as if her expertise and perspective matter. That increased visibility could create diplomatic complications if the collective interprets it as this station providing platform for royal legitimacy claims. Tors leaned back in his chair, studying Thurin with the assessment skills he developed through years of peacekeeping work. Let me be clear about something, Administrator. I will not participate in systematic isolation of a resident based on political convenience for external governments. Caliph Vorsai possesses genuine expertise in political analysis and governmental structures. Consulting with her helps me protect everyone on the station more effectively. If the Marithian Collective has problems with that, they're welcome to file formal complaints through proper diplomatic channels, which you and I both know they won't do because formally acknowledging her existence contradicts their narrative about royal family extinction. Commander, I'm not finished. You're asking me to treat someone as if they should be invisible because their existence is inconvenient for people in power. That's not security protocol. That's complicity in politically motivated erasure. I won't do it. Tor stood, his professional courtesy intact but his position clear. If my approach to resident engagement violates station policy, please document that formally and we'll address it through proper channels. But I'm not going to stop having conversations with people who help me do my job better, just because it makes some external government uncomfortable. Thurin sighed, his expression showing resignation rather than anger. I'm not issuing orders, Commander. I'm asking you to be aware of implications and exercise judgment. That's all. Tors left the meeting frustrated but resolute. He understood Thurin's position. Running an asylum station required navigating impossible political pressures from dozens of governments simultaneously. But he also understood that every compromise in the name of political convenience eroded the fundamental purpose of sanctuary, protecting people regardless of whether that protection was politically convenient. He continued his regular meals with Caliph, now fully aware of what his simple act of sitting beside her represented. A rejection of protocols that demanded her invisibility. A refusal to participate in systems that valued political convenience over individual dignity. A quiet rebellion against the idea that some people should be forgotten, because their existence complicates other people's narratives. Caliph noticed the shift in Tor's demeanor during their next meal together. Something had changed. He was more careful in his language, more aware of their public visibility, subtly protective in ways he hadn't been before. Something's different, she observed quietly after they'd been eating in silence for several minutes. You're treating me differently, more carefully. Tors considered his response, then decided on honesty. Administrator Thurin explained some context about your background that I wasn't fully aware of. Crown Princess Caliph Vors of the Marithian Empire. The political sensitivities around acknowledging your existence versus the collective's preferred narrative about royal family extinction. Caliph's expression closed down immediately, old defensive patterns rising. That person doesn't exist anymore, Commander. The Marithian Empire fell 11 years ago. I'm just an archivist who happens to possess historical knowledge and analytical skills developed during a previous life that's no longer relevant. You're a legitimate political authority who's been systematically erased because acknowledging your existence is inconvenient for the people who stole your government through military force. But they didn't steal it. They took it through violence, which is how most governments actually transfer power throughout history when you strip away the diplomatic language. My family lost. That's not theft or injustice. That's just politics in its rawest form. And now you're supposed to quietly disappear because your existence contradicts their narrative about why revolution was necessary. Kalith was silent for a long moment, her eyes focused on her meal rather than meeting Tor's gaze. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. Why does this matter to you, Commander? You're security chief of an asylum station. Your job is maintaining order and protecting residents from external threats. It's not questioning the political arrangements that keep this place functioning or advocating for individuals whose situations can't be changed. My job is protecting people, all of them, including you, and part of protection is refusing to participate in systems that devalue people based on political convenience. Tors paused, his tone gentling. I'm not going to stop talking to you just because it makes some government uncomfortable. Unless you want me to stop, that's your choice. I don't want you to stop. The admission came quietly, vulnerably, without the careful emotional control Kalith usually maintained. These conversations are the first time in 11 years that anyone has treated me like my thoughts matter beyond historical curiosity. Like I'm more than a diplomatic embarrassment or a pitiable reminder of how far people can fall. I don't want to lose that. Then you won't. Whatever protocols say about keeping you invisible, they can't actually prevent two people from sharing meals and discussing political theory. Administrator Thurin asked me to exercise discretion. I'm exercising it by continuing to value your expertise while being mindful that our association carries implications neither of us can completely control. Their conversation continued, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Tors now acted with full awareness that his simple respect carried political weight, that treating Kalith as if her expertise mattered represented quiet rebellion against systems demanding her erasure. Kalith now understood that Tor's attention wasn't random courtesy, but deliberate choice, choosing to see her truly, rather than accepting the official narrative that she should remain unseen. Around them, the dining facility continued its quiet afternoon rhythms, other residents going about their routines, most unaware of the conversation happening at the small table near the viewport. But some noticed, some always noticed, and the information that Commander Tors had been officially warned about his association with the Marithian exile, but had chosen to continue it anyway. That information began circulating through the station's informal networks, carried by people who understood that such choices meant something in the careful politics of asylum communities. Kalith returned to her residential unit that evening with thoughts churning in ways they hadn't for years. Tors knew who she was now, knew the full context of her situation, and he'd chosen to continue their association anyway, chosen to treat her with dignity despite understanding the political complications. She pulled up her archive work, but found herself unable to concentrate on cataloging historical trade disputes. Instead, she accessed the political analysis databases, searching for case studies of fallen monarchies and restoration movements. Not because she harbored illusions about reclaiming her position. That ship had sailed when the collective executed every potential rival claimant and systematically dismantled royalist networks, but because Tor's respect had awakened something dangerous in her. Purpose. The possibility that maybe she could matter again, could contribute something meaningful, could be more than a historical footnote waiting to be completely forgotten. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope always was, especially for someone who'd learned that hope led to heartbreak when reality proved less generous than wishes suggested. but Caliph couldn't quite suppress it. Because for the first time in 11 years, someone had looked at her directly, seen who she actually was beneath the careful invisibility, and decided she was worth his time anyway. That was worth something. Maybe worth the risk of hoping. Over the following 6 weeks, the pattern of meals and conversations became an established rhythm in both Caliph's and Tor's routines. 3 to 4 times per week, they would coincide in the Sector 7 dining facility during off-peak hours, sharing tables and engaging in discussions that ranged from specific security concerns to broad political philosophy. To Tors, this represented valuable professional development and genuinely pleasant companionship. To Caliph, each interaction reinforced the dangerous realization that she possessed skills and insights that still mattered, that her value hadn't disappeared when her empire fell. But their developing acquaintance created increasingly visible ripples through Bastion's Rest social ecosystem. Other residents couldn't help but notice that Commander Tors, who could choose to associate with any of the station's 12,000 exiles, consistently sought the company of someone who'd spent 11 years being systematically ignored. This violated unspoken protocols in ways that made some residents uncomfortable and made others reconsider assumptions they'd held for years. The former Telvari ambassador, a shrewd political operator named Kasith who'd maintained influence despite 15 years in exile, began actively observing Caliph during station activities. He'd previously dismissed her as irrelevant, a fallen princess with no restoration prospects, not worth the effort of cultivating relationship. But Tor's consistent attention suggested reassessment might be warranted. If the station's security chief found her company valuable enough to seek regularly, perhaps she possessed capabilities Kasith had overlooked. During one of Caliph's routine visits to the station's commercial district to purchase basic supplies, Kasith approached with the careful courtesy that characterized Telvari diplomatic culture. "Princess Caliph," he said, using the title deliberately. "Forgive the intrusion, but I wonder if you might spare a moment for brief discussion. There are matters of potential mutual interest we should address." Caliph stopped, genuinely surprised by the direct approach. Kasith had never spoken to her before beyond the minimal acknowledgments required by basic courtesy. "I'm not a princess anymore, ambassador, just Caliph." Titles are complicated things, aren't they? What we were and what we're called don't always align with what we actually are. Kasith gestured toward a small seating area in a quieter section of the commercial district. "Please. This won't take long, but I believe it would benefit both of us." Caliph followed, her tactical awareness noting that the seating area Kasith had chosen was positioned for privacy while remaining publicly visible. Strategic positioning for a conversation that shouldn't appear secretive but required discretion. They sat across from each other, and Kasith studied her with the assessing gaze of someone trained to evaluate potential assets and liabilities. "I'll speak plainly," Kasith began. "I've been observing your developing association with Commander Tors with considerable interest. The security chief is a perceptive man. He doesn't waste time on meaningless relationships. If he finds your company valuable, that suggests capabilities I may have previously underestimated." "Commander Tors appreciates intelligent conversation," Caliph said carefully. "We discuss political theory and analytical frameworks. It's not complicated. Everything is complicated in asylum politics. Nothing is ever just what it appears to be." Kasith leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his attention focused. "Let me propose something. There are residents on this station who maintain exile governments, who claim legitimate authority over territories they don't currently control. These governments need advisors who understand constitutional structures, succession law, political strategy, exactly the expertise you possess from your training as crown princess." "I've been out of practical politics for 11 years. My knowledge is historical, not current. Historical knowledge is often more valuable than current knowledge. Current politics change constantly." Historical patterns remain consistent. Kaseth's expression showed genuine respect rather than manipulation. I'm not asking you to make commitments or pledge loyalty to any particular cause. I'm suggesting that your expertise could be valuable to multiple exile governments, that providing consultation services could benefit everyone involved. You'd gain meaningful work and perhaps modest compensation. They'd gain access to genuinely skilled political analysis from someone without personal agenda in their specific conflicts. Kaleth's first instinct was refusal. She'd spent 11 years avoiding exactly this kind of engagement, convinced she had nothing valuable to offer and wanting no reminders of her previous life's lost purposes. But Tor's conversations had awakened something, the recognition that expertise didn't disappear with formal position, that analytical skills remained valuable regardless of current circumstances. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "but I'm not making any commitments beyond considering the possibility. That's all I ask, consideration." Kaseth stood with fluid grace. "I'll arrange some introductions if you're willing. Conversations with no obligations, just opportunities to explore whether mutual benefit might exist. You can decline any or all of them without consequence." After Kaseth departed, Kaleth sat in the small seating area processing what had just happened. Someone was actively recruiting her expertise. Someone saw value in capabilities she'd spent years believing were worthless without formal authority to apply them through. The proposition both excited and terrified her in equal measure. She mentioned the encounter to Tors during their next meal together. He listened with his characteristic thoughtful attention, then offered careful analysis. "Kaseth is politically astute. If he's approaching you now, it's because he's recognized that your profile has changed within the station's social ecosystem. My association with you has made you more visible, and Kaseth interprets increased visibility as suggesting increased relevance. So this is happening because of your attention, rather than because my expertise is actually valuable. It's happening because my attention made others look at you more closely and recognize value that was always there, but they'd been trained to ignore." Tors paused. "Whether you engage with his proposition is entirely your choice, but I'll say this. You possess genuine expertise that could help people navigate complex political situations. If you decide to share that expertise, you'll be doing valuable work regardless of how you ended up in position to do it." Kaleth considered his words, then made tentative decision. "I'll meet with some of the exile government representatives Kaseth wants to introduce me to. See if there's actual mutual benefit, or if this is just political maneuvering disguised as opportunity. That's reasonable. And if you need perspective on whether particular individuals or situations seem legitimate versus exploitative, I'm happy to provide security assessment." Over the following 2 weeks, Kaseth arranged a series of introductions. A former planetary governor from a mid-sized world in the Outer Territories sought Kaleth's perspective on constitutional frameworks for the exile government he was attempting to organize. A deposed monarch from a hereditary system asked her analysis of competing succession claims and how to resolve them without triggering civil war among loyalist factions. A military commander planning eventual restoration campaign wanted her assessment of post-conflict governmental structures that could provide stability without recreating the conditions that enabled his original government's collapse. These consultations revealed something Kaleth hadn't fully recognized about herself. Her years in the archives combined with her practical training as Crown Princess had given her genuinely valuable expertise. She understood governmental structures from both theoretical and operational perspectives. She'd studied hundreds of political transitions through historical records. She could analyze legitimacy claims with sophistication that came from years of education and direct experience with exactly these kinds of challenges. And perhaps most importantly, she could offer analysis without personal agenda. She wasn't trying to reclaim her own position or manipulate situations for her benefit. She simply wanted to apply her expertise toward helping people navigate complex problems. In an asylum community where everyone was positioning for advantage or maneuvering for eventual restoration, that apparent disinterest made her paradoxically valuable. Word spread through the exile networks. The Marithian woman in Sector 7 wasn't just a forgotten princess. She was a skilled political strategist who offered sophisticated analysis without trying to leverage it for personal gain. Her consultations remained informal initially, conversations in quiet corners of communal spaces or brief meetings in conference rooms Kaseth arranged. But they gradually developed into something more structured as residents recognized the value she provided. Tors watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. During one of their regular meals, he observed, "You've created something interesting here. A professional reputation based entirely on expertise rather than formal position or political connections." "I'm still processing what's happening," Kaleth admitted. "6 months ago I was invisible. Now people actively seek my advice. The shift is disorienting. You were always capable of providing valuable analysis. You just needed someone to recognize that capability first. You recognized it. Everyone else is just reacting to your attention. I noticed it because I wasn't burdened by knowing who you used to be. But everyone else is responding because your expertise is genuinely useful. I can facilitate recognition, but I can't create capabilities you don't actually possess." Their relationship had evolved into genuine friendship, connection built on mutual respect and consistent engagement, rather than dramatic gestures or emotional intensity. Tors valued Kaleth's insights into station dynamics and broader political patterns that helped him anticipate potential security concerns. Kaleth valued Tor's steady respect and his willingness to treat her as simply Kaleth rather than as crown princess or pitiable exile. But the transformation created complications that neither had fully anticipated. Administrator Thurin grew increasingly concerned as Kaleth's profile continued rising within the station's social ecosystem. He called Tors for another discussion, this time with more urgency in his tone. "The Marithian Collective has filed a formal inquiry about increased political activity around their exiled princess," Thurin explained, displaying diplomatic correspondence on his office's holographic systems. "They're not threatening to withdraw station support yet, but they're clearly uncomfortable with her raised visibility. They want assurances that we're not providing platform for legitimacy claims or restoration movements. She's providing political consultation to other exile governments. That's not prohibited by asylum protocols, and it's not the same thing as making active claims to Marithian authority. The collective may not see that distinction. From their perspective, a competent and respected crown princess maintaining visible presence contradicts their narrative that the royal family was corrupt, incompetent, and rightfully removed. Her very existence challenges their governmental legitimacy." Thurin's expression showed genuine concern rather than bureaucratic annoyance. "I'm not asking you to stop your association with her. I'm asking you to help me manage the situation before it escalates into diplomatic incident that could jeopardize this station's operational funding and political protections." Tors considered this carefully. "What specifically are you asking me to do?" "Help her understand that increased visibility carries risks. Encourage her to exercise discretion about how public her consultation work becomes. Work with me to demonstrate to the collective that we're maintaining appropriate oversight without actually restricting her legitimate activities." Tors brought these concerns to Kaleth during their next conversation. She listened with her characteristic analytical calm, then offered her own assessment. "Administrator Thurin is right to be concerned. The collective's governmental legitimacy does rest partially on narratives about royal family elimination and the necessity of revolutionary transformation. My increased visibility threatens those narratives in ways the collective won't tolerate indefinitely. So what do you want to do? Caliph was quiet for a long time, staring out the viewport at the distant stars visible through the station's transparent sections. For 11 years I've been hiding, telling myself I was forgotten and worthless, that I had nothing to offer beyond basic survival. You showed me that was false, that I still possess skills and expertise that matter. I don't want to surrender that just because it makes some government uncomfortable. But, Torres prompted gently, but I also understand that defying the collective carries real costs. They could pressure the Dominion to revoke my asylum, could create conditions that force me to choose between maintaining sanctuary and maintaining visibility. She turned from the viewport to meet Tor's eyes directly. I need to be strategic about how I proceed, not retreating back into invisibility, but being careful about how visible I become and what that visibility represents. They spent the next hour developing strategy. Caliph would continue her consultation work, but more discreetly, maintaining lower profile while still providing valuable expertise. She'd establish formal protocols for her advisory services, documented arrangements that made her work legitimate and transparent rather than shadowy political maneuvering that could be characterized as restoration plotting. Torres would work with Administrator Thurin to demonstrate appropriate oversight, not restricting Caliph's legitimate activities, but ensuring everything remained within asylum protocols and documented through proper channels. The goal was satisfying the collective's concerns about visibility without actually limiting Caliph's meaningful engagement with the work she discovered mattered to her. But even as they developed these careful strategies, external events were moving in directions neither could control or predict. News reached Bastion's Rest through regular information feeds. The Marithian collective was experiencing significant internal instability. The military junta that had governed for 11 years was fracturing, with different commanders competing for dominance. Economic problems and regional conflicts were straining the government's legitimacy with civilian populations. And critically, some factions within Marithian society were beginning to question whether permanent military rule represented sustainable governance model. Caliph absorbed these developments with complex emotions. Part of her felt vindicated. The collective was proving exactly as incompetent at governing as she'd always believed military juntas inevitably became. Part of her felt grief for what was happening to her people, the chaos and suffering that political instability inevitably produced. And part of her felt something she'd suppressed for 11 years, possibility. If the collective was truly failing, if Marithian society was genuinely questioning military rule's sustainability, then maybe, just maybe, there might eventually be space for alternative forms of governance to be seriously considered. It was a dangerous thought. Hope had hurt her before, had led to heartbreak when reality proved less generous than wishes. But she couldn't quite suppress the feeling rising in her chest as she watched Marithian political developments with her trained analyst's eye and recognized patterns she'd studied in hundreds of historical cases. The collective was showing all the classic signs of governmental system approaching critical failure. The question wasn't whether they'd collapse eventually. It was whether anyone would be ready with viable alternatives when that collapse occurred. And for the first time in 11 years, Caliph Vorsai began seriously considering what it might mean if she decided to be ready. If she chose to position herself not for dramatic restoration through force, but for patient preparation toward possibility. It was terrifying and thrilling simultaneously, because choosing to hope meant risking everything she'd carefully protected during her years of invisible exile. But the alternative, remaining safely obscure while possibilities developed without her, suddenly felt like greater risk than hoping. Torres noticed the shift in her demeanor during their meals together. You're thinking about something significant, something that's changing how you see your situation. Caliph didn't deny it. The Marithian collective is failing. Not immediately, but the pattern is clear. And failures like this create opportunities, not for military intervention or forced restoration, but for alternative governance models to be seriously considered if they're ready when opportunities develop. And you're thinking about being ready. I'm thinking about whether remaining invisible is actually the safer choice, or if safety is just another word for cowardice when real possibilities exist. Tors was quiet, understanding that this was Calith's decision to make rather than something he could advise her about from outside perspective. Finally, he said simply, "Whatever you decide, you won't be facing it alone. That's what friends do. They stand with you when you make difficult choices, even when outcomes are uncertain." And somehow, that quiet assurance mattered more than any grand gesture or dramatic declaration could have. Because Calith was learning that dignity didn't come from titles or formal positions. It came from being seen truly by people who chose to stand beside you regardless of whether that choice was convenient or safe. She was being seen. For the first time in 11 years, she was genuinely being seen. And that changed everything. The weeks following Calith's realization about the Marithian collective's deteriorating stability brought accelerating changes to her situation and her sense of what might be possible. She continued her consultation work with residents seeking political expertise, but now with additional purpose beyond simply applying useful skills. Each consultation became an opportunity to refine her thinking about governmental structures, transitional frameworks, legitimacy building in post-conflict situations. She was preparing, though for what exactly remained uncertain. Tours continued their regular meals and conversations, but now with awareness that Calith was processing something significant. He didn't push for details or demand to know her plans. He simply maintained steady presence, offering perspective when asked and companionship when words weren't necessary. Their friendship had deepened into something rare, genuine trust built through sustained respect rather than dramatic bonding experiences. 3 months after the initial news about Marithian instability, a delegation arrived at Bastion's Rest requesting formal audience with Calith Vorsai. The delegation's arrival was handled through proper diplomatic channels. Administrator Thurin received advance notice, security protocols were implemented, meeting spaces were arranged. But the delegation itself was unusual. Not representatives of the collective or any formal governmental body, but a coalition of Marithian civilians, religious leaders, and minor nobles who'd been organizing quietly within Marithian society. The delegation's leader was an elderly woman named Terrace, who'd served as a low-level administrative official in the imperial government before the collapse. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd survived difficult years without being broken by them, her gray hair worn in traditional Marithian styles, and her clothing combining modern practicality with subtle nods to imperial aesthetics. Calith agreed to meet with them in a formal conference chamber that Administrator Thurin arranged. Neutral space that didn't suggest either endorsement or restriction of their discussion. Tours attended as security oversight, positioned discreetly near the entrance but clearly present. Terrace addressed Calith with formal respect but without obsequious deference. "Your Highness, we come representing a coalition of Marithians who believe our people deserve better governance than military junta can provide. We've been organizing quietly for several years, building networks and discussing alternatives. Recent events have convinced us that the collective's collapse may be approaching faster than we anticipated." "Please just call me Calith," she responded. "I haven't been crowned princess in any meaningful sense for 11 years. Titles from dead empires don't carry actual authority. With respect, authority isn't just about formal position. It's about legitimacy, continuity, connection to something larger than immediate power." Terrace gestured to include her delegation colleagues. "We believe the Marithian people need connection to their history and culture, not just whatever military commanders happen to control governmental machinery at any given moment. You represent that connection, living embodiment of continuity with our imperial past, but also someone who's experienced the consequences of that past's failures. What exactly are you proposing? Terrace leaned forward, her expression serious. We're proposing that you consider returning to Marithian space, not to reclaim power through force. We lack military capacity for that, and more violence isn't what our people need. But to offer yourself as legitimate alternative authority, symbol of continuity that could provide stability during what might become chaotic transition. Calith felt her chest tighten, with emotions she'd suppressed for years. The collective has spent 11 years convincing people that the royal family was corrupt and incompetent, that revolution was necessary to save Marithian civilization from imperial failures. Many people believe that narrative. Some do, many don't, and those who might have believed it are reconsidering as they watch the collective's own governance failures become increasingly obvious. Another delegation member spoke, a younger woman wearing religious symbols marking her as member of one of Marithia's traditional faith communities. The collective promised stability and prosperity. They've delivered neither. People are questioning whether military rule was actually necessary or if it was just power grab dressed up as revolutionary necessity. But even if some people are questioning the collective's legitimacy, that doesn't mean they'd welcome royal restoration. They might prefer entirely new governmental forms, democratic systems, confederated structures, something that doesn't carry any connection to either military junta or imperial monarchy. They might, Terrace agreed, which is why we're not asking you to return immediately or make dramatic claims to authority. We're asking if you're willing to be ready, to develop frameworks for transitional governance that could work if people choose to support them, to build coalition relationships among exile communities that could translate into viable alternative if circumstances create opportunity. You're asking me to prepare for possibilities without any guarantee those possibilities will develop into realities. Yes, we're asking you to hope, knowing that hope might lead to disappointment. Terrace's expression softened with understanding. We know what we're asking is difficult, but we believe your people deserve to have options beyond military rule or complete chaos. You could be one of those options if you're willing. Calith looked at the delegation members, people who'd risked significant personal danger to make this journey, who'd organized quietly for years while the collective maintained surveillance and suppression of political opposition. They weren't asking her to be savior or miracle worker. They were asking her to be ready to serve if serving became possible. She asked for time to consider their proposition, and the delegation agreed to return in 1 week for her response. After they departed, Calith sat in the conference chamber with Tors, processing what had just happened. They're offering me something I thought I'd lost forever, she said quietly. Purpose beyond survival. The possibility that I might matter to my people again, that my life could mean something larger than just existing in exile. What do you want to do? I'm terrified of wanting this, of letting myself hope only to have that hope destroyed when reality proves more complicated than idealism suggests. She looked at Tors, seeking honest perspective rather than reassurance. Tell me I'm not being foolish. Tell me this isn't just desperate grasp at meaning from someone who's been adrift so long. She'll believe anything that promises purpose. Tors was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. I can't tell you what the right choice is. That's yours to make. But I can tell you that from what I've observed, you possess genuine capabilities that could benefit your people during difficult transition. Whether you choose to apply those capabilities is decision only you can make based on what kind of life you want your life to mean. What would you do? I chose to sit beside you in a dining facility when protocols suggested I shouldn't, because treating you with simple dignity felt more important than following unspoken rules. I'm not good at choosing safe paths when alternative paths feel more meaningful. He paused, but I'm also not the one who'll face consequences if this fails. You are. So my answer to "what would you do" matters less than your answer to "what do I want my life to mean?" Caliph spent the following week in intense deliberation that consumed her thoughts and dominated her time. She consulted with residents whose expertise she'd come to trust. The former Telvari ambassador who'd successfully navigated exile politics for 15 years. A deposed monarch who'd attempted failed restoration and could speak about what went wrong. Several academic specialists in transitional governance and post-conflict reconstruction. She reviewed historical records extensively, studying cases of successful political restorations and catastrophic failures. She analyzed the current Mauritian situation from every analytical angle she could develop. She tried to separate genuine possibility from wishful thinking, realistic assessment from desperate hope. And she talked with Tors during their regular meals, working through her thoughts aloud while he listened with characteristic thoughtful attention and offered perspective without judgment. During one late-night conversation in the observation lounge overlooking the station's docking areas, Caliph articulated her deepest fear. "I'm afraid of wanting this too much, of letting hope override clear analysis because I'm desperate for my life to matter in ways larger than just consultation work and archive cataloging. I'm afraid I'll make terrible decisions because I want meaning more than I want truth." That's a legitimate concern, Tors acknowledged. But the alternative is letting fear of disappointment prevent you from engaging with real possibilities. You can stay here, continue your consultation work, remain safely in exile. That's viable choice. Or you can accept risk of trying to matter in larger ways, knowing it might fail spectacularly and hurt worse than if you'd never tried at all. How do I know which choice is right? You don't. That's what makes it a choice rather than a calculation. Tors was quiet, watching stars visible through the observation port. But I'll say this, in the time I've known you, I've watched you transform from someone who'd convinced herself she was worthless into someone who recognizes her genuine capabilities and value. That transformation happened because you were willing to risk engagement despite fear of disappointment. This is similar choice at larger scale. Caliph made her decision. When the delegation returned 1 week later, she agreed to position herself as alternative authority for Mauritian people seeking options beyond military rule. Not through aggressive restoration attempts or military intervention, but through patient development of governance frameworks, careful coalition building, and strategic visibility that offered people genuine choice about their political future. It wasn't dramatic declaration or revolutionary commitment. It was methodical preparation for possibility, acceptance that serving her people might become possible if circumstances developed appropriately, and she was ready when they did. The work transformed her completely. The withdrawn woman who'd eaten alone in empty dining facilities was gone, replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority and genuine purpose. She maintained careful discretion. Administrator Thurin's concerns about visibility were valid, but no longer hid. She walked station corridors with head up, acknowledging greetings from residents who now treated her with respect due to someone whose expertise and legitimacy were recognized rather than suppressed. The Mauritian Coalition provided resources for her work. Access to detailed information about current conditions within Mauritian space, connections to other exile communities who might support eventual transition, analysis of which regions and populations might be receptive to alternative governance, and which remained committed to collective rule or preferred entirely different political structures. Caliph dove into this work with intensity she hadn't felt since before the empire's fall. She developed detailed transitional governance frameworks, constitutional structures that could provide stability during political restructuring, economic policies that addressed conditions that contributed to imperial collapse, institutional arrangements that balanced continuity with necessary reform. She built coalitions among Mauritian exile communities scattered across multiple systems, creating networks of people who might translate into governance capacity if opportunity developed. She consulted extensively with experts in post-conflict reconstruction, learning from both successful and failed historical cases. And through it all, Torres maintained steady presence, friend who celebrated her renewed sense of purpose while also providing realistic perspective about challenges and risks. Their meals together continued, but now often included discussions of specific tactical and strategic questions Caliph was navigating rather than just abstract political theory. 6 months after her initial decision to prepare for possibility, news reached Bastion's Rest that the Mauritian collective had indeed collapsed. The military junta fractured into competing factions, whose conflicts were devastating what remained of Mauritian civilization's infrastructure and institutions. Regional commanders were declaring independence. Economic systems were failing. Civilian populations were experiencing genuine humanitarian crises as governmental structures dissolved into chaos. The Mauritian coalition sent urgent communication. Circumstances had created opportunity faster than anyone anticipated. The time for action was now rather than future preparation. Would Caliph come? She stood in her residential unit that had been home for 11 years, looking at modest possessions that represented a life she'd built from ruins of everything she'd lost. Looking at data tablets containing governance frameworks she'd developed over months of careful work. Looking at communication from people asking her to step forward and attempt to serve her people during their darkest hours since the imperial collapse. Torres found her there that evening, sitting quietly in darkness broken only by starlight through the small viewport. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply sat beside her in comfortable silence, waiting until she was ready to talk. "I'm leaving," Caliph said finally. "Tomorrow. The coalition has arranged transport and is coordinating with regional leaders who might support transitional governance structures. This is happening. Are you ready?" "I don't know, but I don't think anyone is ever truly ready for something this significant." She turned from the viewport to look at him directly. "Thank you for everything you've done, for seeing me when I'd convinced myself I was invisible, for treating me like I mattered when everyone else had decided I didn't, for standing beside me while I figured out who I wanted to be. You did the actual work of transformation. I just happened to notice what was already there. It's more than that. You chose to notice, chose to engage, chose to treat me with dignity when that choice violated protocols and created complications for you professionally." Her voice carried emotions she was finally learning to feel again after years of careful emotional suppression. "You gave me back myself, reminded me that my worth isn't dependent on formal position or political status, that I have genuine value to offer independent of titles or claims." "What you're heading toward carries both titles and claims," Torres observed. "But I understand the difference now. If I reclaim anything in Mauritian space, it will be because I've earned legitimacy through competence and service, not because I'm asserting birthright." She stood, looking around the residential unit one final time. "This place was sanctuary when I needed it, but I'm ready to leave now, ready to try mattering in larger ways, even knowing I might fail catastrophically." The next day, Bastion's Rest gathered to witness Caliph's departure. Not an official ceremony, but an informal acknowledgement from residents who'd watched her transformation with various degrees of interest, respect, or calculation. Administrator Thurin offered formal wishes for success, while clearly relieved that diplomatic complications would be leaving his station. Merchant Caseth provided tactical advice about navigating Mauritian political networks. The Centauri physician who'd noticed her change months ago offered medical supplies for the journey. And Torres accompanied her to the docking bay where transport waited, carrying bags containing her modest possessions and data storage with governance frameworks she'd developed. "This is terrifying," Caliph admitted as they stood together in the docking bay, watching technicians prepare the transport vessel. Everything could go wrong. The coalition might fracture, regional leaders might reject my authority, the collective's remnants might reassert control through superior military force. I could end up back here in a year having accomplished nothing, except proving my irrelevance. Or you could help your people navigate impossible situation towards something better than chaos or military dictatorship. Tor's expression showed quiet confidence. You possess capabilities that genuinely matter. Whether you succeed or fail, you'll have tried to serve when you could have chosen safety. That means something regardless of outcomes. They stood in comfortable silence for final moments. Two people whose chance encounter in a dining facility transformation neither could have predicted. Then Caliph did something impulsive. She embraced Tors briefly, a gesture of genuine affection and gratitude that transcended formal courtesy. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me, for sitting beside me like I was worth your time, for treating me like a queen when I'd forgotten I was one." Tors returned the embrace with warmth that matched hers. "You were always worth the time. I'm just glad I noticed." Caliph boarded the transport, settling into passenger accommodations for the journey that would take her back to Marithian space for the first time in 11 years. As the vessel departed Bastion's Rest, she watched through viewports as the station receded into distance. The place that had been her sanctuary and her prison, the place where she'd hidden and eventually rediscovered herself. She felt fear. She felt excitement. She felt the weight of responsibility for people who'd chosen to trust her with something precious, the possibility that their future might be better than their present. But most of all, she felt dignity. The quiet certainty that she mattered, that her life had meaning beyond mere survival, that she possessed genuine value to offer independent of titles or formal positions. And it had all begun because a human security officer sat beside her in a quiet dining facility and treated her like she was worth his time. Like she was a queen, even when she'd forgotten she was one. The universe was vast and often indifferent. But sometimes, in forgotten corners of asylum stations, someone chose to see you truly. And that simple choice could change everything, could awaken dignity long buried, could restore purpose thought lost, could prove that worth came not from what others decided about you, but from what you chose to become when someone finally gave you the chance. Caliph Vorsai was heading home, not to reclaim what was lost. That empire was gone forever and she'd made peace with its death.